Okay, so we're back. Last time we talked about different kinds of measures that the Hebrew Bible takes in order to ameliorate the problems of poverty, injustice, economic hardship, and so forth. And we called it the ancient Israelite social safety net. We were only able to do a brief overview because there really is an awful lot of stuff in the Hebrew Bible about that. But tonight what we want to do is focus a little bit on a special case, which is the single woman who does not have any support, no family, she's lost husband, no kids, is basically on her own. The widow, in other words, which is kind of a catch-all phrase that doesn't necessarily mean just someone who has lost a spouse. It can also include someone who is a divorcee, a rape victim, even the accused adulteress, the female war captive, even the daughter who sold into slavery out of the desperation of her parents. So we'll be talking a little bit about all of these, but before we do, I want to state, because it needs to be stated and restated, that the Old Testament is a document of its times. There were different cultural factors in play than we have now. There were different views on the responsibilities of one person or a nation towards the people, towards one another. This included matters of gender. Laws were put in place to temper some of the knee-jerk responses that one might find in a traditional society or any other society that happens to consist of humans. And some of what we find here is doubtless going to be uncomfortable, but what I want you to consider is that most of what we're looking at here are ways that were proposed to try to ameliorate some of the abuses or the catch-22s that people found themselves in. There was a very good reason why the Old Testament is concerned with women without support, and that is because a woman who didn't have family, didn't have a means of support, was basically a dead woman walking. There was not much that could be done. There was a very real risk that they would die of neglect or starvation or some other kind of exploitive circumstance. And this was, frankly, a concern. And so efforts were made to try to fix this, and some of them were kind of unusual. Some of them were quite clever. I don't know that they would necessarily apply today, but we'll take a look at them anyway, just because after I'm done, Missy will talk about the lone woman today. And believe me, there are some surprising, at least to me, and some sobering realities that she'll be talking about. Okay, so in order to ensure security, a woman basically needed a husband and children, preferably one or more sons. And according to the cultural institutions of the times, the ideal solution for the lone woman was to find a new husband, even a temporary one who could at least give her a child. The widow, technically, was a woman who had lost her husband. If she lacked children, her case was especially desperate. So we have the story of Elijah living with the widow who has just the one son. The son dies, which means she's cooked. I mean, she's done. Elijah raises her son, and that basically saves them both, quite honestly. Now, most married women could rely on something that they received prior to the marriage, which was called, well, the King James translated as a bride price, which is totally wrong. It was a sum of money that was given to the woman's father by the bridegroom as a condition for being able to marry the father's daughter. The bride price is not what it was about. It was, we're going to use the Hebrew word because I'm not sure that there's a proper English equivalent, but it was mohar. And the mohar was not, it was sort of an emergency fund. It was kept by the father in case something happened to the husband. The woman could fall back on this sum of money. It was maybe in extravagant circumstances, it could act like a pension. In less lavish ways, it could be just a kind of fund to keep you going until you could make your way to family or some other place somewhere else and start over. And like I said, it was usually kept by the bride's father, which may or may not be a good thing. It depends on how much you trust your father with that kind of money. There's the story of Rachel and Leah, who were the wives of Jacob. And Jacob is thinking that he's given enough of his time and energy and effort to their father Laban, and so he calls them out into the open field where they can talk privately and says, look, do you guys want to just get out of here? You know, I'm done with Laban. I don't want to work for him anymore. And their answer is, well, since he's already spent our mohars, there's no real reason for us to hang around here anyway. So, yeah, we're out of here. You know, so it's an interesting instance of that particular institution gone wrong. Now, all that having been said, the mechanics of marriage was still cause for anxiety, even among women who you would think were immune from, or were in a situation where they did not have to worry about that. I'm thinking, for instance, of Sarah, the wife of Abraham, who was like stinking rich, but she, a lot of her rivalry with her handmaid Hagar, with whom Abraham had a son, legally it would belong to Sarah. That was the way this institution worked. They came up with some rather imaginative ways for coming up with offspring that could inherit even if a woman wasn't capable of having a baby. Hagar was kind of putting herself forward a bit, and Sarah was fine with that until she saw Ishmael, Hagar's son, playing with her son Isaac, and realizing, oh crap, that's a rivalry in the making. Hagar, you're out of here. And so there was this concern that even with her own son could somehow be displaced, and she would be left out in the cold, no matter what. So this was a hard thing, and of course it didn't work out that way. Sarah ended up dying before Abraham, but there was always that fear that something like this could happen. Now, one possibility that could happen when someone, if a woman's husband died without providing any offspring, was something called the levirate marriage. Levirate comes from a Latin word which I believe means brother-in-law or something like that. But the way it worked was, if a man died without producing an heir, the man's oldest brother would then go to the widow. He would give her a child, and that child would take the place of the dead brother as far as taking care of his sister-in-law. Normally, that sort of union was forbidden by Leviticus, but they made a special exemption. In this case, one of the problems with that was that with one of the brothers gone, the oldest brother could expect to receive that much more of the inheritance when their father died. Of course, so he's by giving his sister-in-law a son, he's basically splitting up the inheritance, and he's working against his own financial interests. That was one reason why this never really caught on very much. I'll leave it to you to imagine any number of other reasons why this was a massively unpopular law. And in fact, there were some bits in the Torah where they're trying to figure out how to persuade people to actually do this and to comply with this rule, which is a pretty good indication that they were at least trying to do it. The question always comes up, did they actually do this stuff? I think in this case, yeah, they tried. How successful they were, I think, is a matter of debate. Now, another famous case of the levirate marriage involves a woman named Tamar. Now, she was the daughter-in-law of Judah, the patriarch of the tribe of Judah. Her husband died, and so her husband's brother, Onan, went in to give her a child, ostensibly. He famously did not, hence our term onanism, and he died as a result. The Lord was not happy, apparently, with that. And one thing led to another, and I think there was another brother who went in, and he died an untimely death. And Judah was saying, I'm not going to throw any more sons at this. This is just a bad thing. So Tamar is stuck. She doesn't have she doesn't have offspring. She doesn't have progeny. What is she going to do? Well, she literally takes matters into her own hands. She finds out that Judah is going to be shearing sheep at a certain time in a certain place, and at that certain time and place, she shows up disguised as a prostitute and manages to persuade Judah to have sex with her. He does, but when he sends the messenger with the payment later, she's not there, so he doesn't know what happened or anything like that. Meanwhile, Tamar has suddenly turned pregnant. And Judah says, oh, well, you've been messing around. This is an easy way to solve this problem. You are an adulteress. We're going to execute you. And she says, oh, by the way, the guy whose staff and steel are these is the father of my child. And Judah looks at it and said, oops. And realized that, Tamar had basically managed to get herself twins, as it turned out, by seducing her father-in-law. The story is very interesting because it's very matter-of-fact. It is very secular. There are no visions, no dreams, no angels, no voice of God, nothing miraculous, except maybe Judah's gullibility. But the Bible is clearly approving that she was willing to do what she had to do at great personal risk to secure a future for herself and her family. One of her, oh no, I'm thinking of someone else. Okay, so another example is the case of Ruth, and who, with her mother-in-law Naomi, they had both lost their husbands. They went into a country where, an agricultural region, where they would glean for food. She caught the attention of Boaz, who also, it turns out, was a relative, and he managed to, things managed to work out to where Boaz was able to get approval from the leaders of the town. There's this woman here, she's a widow, I would like to marry her, and they said, there was like one minor sticking point, but it turned out not to be a thing, and so she gets married, and she has a child named Oded, and the reason why this is important is because he was the grandfather of King David. So that's why the story of Ruth is considered important. But it's another example of this idea of doing whatever you had to do to secure for yourself as a woman some kind of security and future. Now, the problem becomes more difficult when you are dealing with a situation, for example, if a woman was forced into a sexual encounter against her will, if she was raped. Generally, a woman who had been raped for various cultural reasons was considered unmarriageable. So what was the penalty? Well, the penalty was very interesting because, remember, the concern with the Hebrew legislation is to take care of the lone woman. Now, this is often, the perpetrator pays a sum of 50 shekels. Basically, that's a substitute mohar. That's something to take care of her in the event that he dies or wanders off. He cannot divorce her, which is not to say, say she has to marry her rapist. It's really not like that. It's more like the rapist had the responsibility for taking care of her for the rest of his life. That's what it really amounts to. The question is 50 shekels. What does that get you? Well, Joseph was sold to the Midianites for 20 shekels. David purchased the site for the Jerusalem temple for 50 shekels, so prime real estate, Micah offers a wandering Levite 10 pieces of silver a year, a set of clothes, and your living. So that would basically cover incidentals for 5 years. So you could probably live off 50 shekels for, I don't know, a year or two, maybe more if you stretched it. Jeremiah buys a farm for 17 pieces of silver. So that gives you some idea of what you could do with 50 shekels. It was a pretty hefty sum. It was not trivial. So that was, an important, innovation, if you want to call it that. She's not going to be able to be married, but she can at least be taken care of. And the guy who did it is going to be responsible for it. If he wanders off or whatever, she still keeps the money. That is very clear. The other problem, and this is kind of an interesting case, this was in Numbers 27, considers the problem of inheritance. For the most part, the wife could inherit on the death of the husband, or the son would inherit on the death of the father. And how they split that up was kind of on a case-by-case basis. But what happened if a father died leaving no son but only daughters? Well, the answer to that is a very famous case concerning the daughters of Zelophehad. It's only famous if you can pronounce Zelophehad and you're an Old Testament geek like me. This was an instance where, and they go into quite a bit of detail about this story. I believe it's in Numbers 27, where these women, these 5 daughters, their father dies, there's no son, and in such a case, the inheritance would normally go to the father's brother. That would leave them basically with nothing. So they go straight to Moses and say, this isn't fair. We should be able to inherit what our father left. And Moses says, okay, let me take this up with the boss. And God says, yeah, they're right. They are correct. That's the way it should be. And a whole string of legislation comes out as a result of that takes up the rest of the chapter. And it's a little bit convoluted and doesn't necessarily cover every instance, but it's a very important piece of what we might call case law in this instance. Let's see. Okay, there was another, we talked about illicit sexual encounters. Here's another one, and that is the accused adulteress. Now, as you can see, this was not one of those, oh, that's okay, I did the same kind of thing when I was a kid, that sort of thing. The penalty in the Bible is quite harsh. The adulteress will be put to death. Stoning was the usual way of doing it. And this created a problem because spurious accusations of adultery are a cultural problem in pretty much every culture where adultery is a crime. And so what do you do? How do you handle these kinds of problems when there is a jealous husband who is freaking out thinking, oh, my wife has been unfaithful to me? So Numbers 5 has this remarkable ritual called the test of jealousy. If the spirit of jealousy comes over him, the husband, and he is jealous of his wife who has defiled herself, allegedly, or if the spirit of jealousy comes over him and he is jealous of his wife, though she has not defiled herself, then the man shall bring his wife to the priest. Well, what happens then? There's this elaborate ceremony where the wife steps up to the altar. There's a special installation in the temple, especially for this ritual. And the wife swears an oath of her innocence. The priest takes a vessel of sacred water and some dust from the ground of a certain part of the sanctuary, and also writes a curse on a piece of parchment and dips it in the water. And then the woman drinks this water, and if she's guilty, her body will swell up and her thigh will fall off, whatever that means. But the key thing is she will not be able to have children anymore. Now, so that's the ritual. And now, reading this over, I realized that there was something truly devious and truly subversive going on here. So bear with me as we go through the implications of the ritual of jealousy. Okay, first of all, the husband has no proof, first of all, so that's why there needs to be a test in the first place. The second is that God determines the guilt or innocence of the party. This is the only instance in all of Hebrew legislation where God is the one who decides who's innocent and who's guilty. Very interesting case. If the woman has a child after the ordeal, she's innocent. Absolutely, no question about it. So if she, shows up pregnant and goes through the ritual and she gives birth to a healthy child afterwards, well, that's it. She didn't commit adultery. If she's past the age of childbearing, the test tells you nothing. It doesn't tell you anything. And if the woman was already unable to have children, the test can't be conclusive either. So if the woman does not have children after the ordeal, maybe she's guilty, but there are also plenty of other reasons why she couldn't do it. In other words, there's almost no way that the test can result in an absolutely, positively, yes, she's guilty verdict. And just in case you missed this, the death penalty goes away. No stoning. Nothing like that happens after that. The test itself also encompasses the punishment. And if that doesn't happen, well, you don't go and stone her. This is God's thing. He takes care of it. He's the one who decides. So I have to really kind of wonder if a large part of this was done because the idea was to just kind of create this thing where the legal circumstances were stacked heavily in favor of the woman, as opposed to the way it would normally be, where an accusation from a male would be enough to convict her, but that wasn't the case. Now, once again, there's the question, did they actually do this? We do know that they did build installations for this in the previous temple. Also in the later temple, there seems to have been something like that in here. Let's see. Oh, another interesting thing here is that by the time of the late, maybe what we call the Deuteronomic period, which would have been the few decades before the end of the Jerusalem temple, the kingdom decided to centralize all of the temple services in Jerusalem. So if you were living way out in the sticks and you suspected your wife of doing this, if you were going to go do this test, you had to haul her all the way to Jerusalem just to run this test, which would have added another inconvenience factor and probably a good counter incentive for doing anything like that. We also should point out something too. In other words, what the Bible is doing, I think, is that they're trying to make it difficult to do the wrong thing. And I think the same thing could be said of the penalty of stoning. It's my belief that the Jewish legislators chose stoning specifically because it was the most difficult and inconvenient form of capital punishment. It required participation by the entire community, so the entire community basically owned it. Everybody had to watch the killing of another human being slowly, brutally, up close and personal, messy, disgusting, horrible. And just as a side note, basically the entire community would contract corpse contamination, which would render them unable to participate in the religious life of the community until they got that cleaned up. Actual references to actual stonings are actually quite rare in the Bible. They don't happen very often. And in fact, even among Islam, which has kind of become known for stoning, prior to the dissolution of the caliphate in 1920 or thereabouts, stonings were extremely rare. They just didn't happen. In fact, their way of dealing with adultery, accusation of adultery, were almost funny. I mean, there was this incredible reluctance to actually convict a woman, let alone sentence her. So they'd come up with these wild things like, well, there was this one mystic, Ali so-and-so, who was in his mother's womb for 3 years before he was born, so yeah, it could still be his, even though he's been out on caravan since, 11 months ago, The other thing is that they just simply refused to sentence people sentence women to death for this sort of thing. The founder of Wahhabi Islam, a guy named Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahhab, who is a real nutcase, by the way, and what you could charitably call a hanging judge type of person. He was this jurist who would go from town to town offering his services as a judge, and the reason he went from town to town is because he was frequently run out of town because they didn't like his harsh sentences. And probably the one time he got the closest to actually being lynched was when he decreed a penalty of stoning for a woman accused of adultery. In fact, the Ottoman judicial system, this is the Turkish Ottoman Empire, in 500 years of Ottoman jurisprudence, they handed down a sentence of stoning for adultery exactly once. In 500 years. That's how rare it was. So what happened, the reason we see it more in the 20th century is partly due to the fall of the caliphate and the rise of radicals to fill in the vacuum, and also a lot of these are extrajudicial. They're more tribal council things than Muslim Sharia types of things. That's a whole other thing. But in the 1970s, some conservative elements in the Pakistani government decided that it was time to bring back some of these traditional punishments in a public forum, and so they were, bringing back, stonings and lashings and what have you, and the people just kind of got sick of it real fast. In fact, there were a number of executions that got called off because nobody showed up. I think people actually tend to be better than we give them credit for in certain circumstances, and I think this might be one of them. Let's see. Now, there's one that I don't seem to have slides for, but I want to just quickly go over it, and that was this is also kind of interesting, because this is the case of the female war captive. There was this was one where typically if you were a captive in an ancient Near Eastern nation who lost whatever war was going on, you could pretty much expect a life of misery and expect to be abused and sexually exploited and be a slave and so on and so on. It was not a good thing. But Deuteronomy introduces an interesting set of rules which refines and humanizes other rules that we find earlier, maybe not necessarily stated judicially, but accounts like what we find in Judges and things like that. The woman who was taken as a captive was first of all given 30 days without any kind of, nothing was expected of her. She was allowed to mourn her parents, her family. Her head would be shaved as a gesture of mourning. Her fingernails would be shaved, trimmed, again as a gesture of mourning. This was something that Israelite women did. And after that, she was allowed to, or if she wanted to, she could become a bondswoman. Or if an Israelite male thought, I kind of like her, I'd like to marry her, she could marry her, which meant that she had to have a mohar, she had to have that cash thing. And the text is explicit, she is not to be treated as a slave. You cannot sell her. If she doesn't like him, she can leave him, and she takes her money with it. And in fact, it uses the term specifically, she is his wife, which also means she can inherit. In other words, she had basically all of the same rights that an Israelite woman would have, which I find this is to be kind of a remarkable, practice. Deuteronomy is kind of amazing that way. Now, the last one that we're going to talk about, and then we're going to hand it over to Missy, is this rare, hopefully it wasn't too common, but this case of a family where things had gotten so bad financially that they were on the edge of complete destitution. Now, in such cases, if a family did become destitute, everybody was really vulnerable, and there would be a very strong temptation to sell off the young daughters to whoever happened to have the money. There's legislation to say, well, now hold on a minute. We're not going to do it that way. The idea was, okay, yes, she's being sold technically as a slave, but she's not being treated as a slave. The idea is that eventually she would be married off to one of the members of the household. And if that marriage or marriage preparations were not forthcoming within the proper period of time, she was free to go. And, and her family would keep the price of her purchase so that, she could have that to fall back on. Once again, you keep the mohar, you keep it handy for the woman to rely on. The thing about the Bible is that slavery as an institution was very multifaceted, it was very complex. There were a lot of rules and laws about it, and there's a kind of a belief out there that the Bible endorses slavery. That's really not true. It acknowledges slavery, it holds its nose and puts up with slavery, but at the same time, it's always looking for some way to cushion some of the worst abuses and to find some sneaky way to free people if there's a way that they can get away with it. Let's see. So, it does seem fairly clear that we keep seeing this pattern of finding some way to get some kind of a fund to the woman who is in trouble, and she is able to hang on to it if things do not go as planned, if they don't go the way they're supposed to. Not every woman could be a Tamar or a Ruth. Not every woman had a handmaid that she could say to her husband, here, take what's her name and let's have a son and it will be mine. Not everybody had that, but it is fairly clear when you read a little more deeply that the Bible was very concerned about this sort of thing, and that they were trying to make the best of a bad system. They meant well. There is an understanding that patriarchy and dominant male attitudes posed a problem, that they were prone to excess. The Bible does try to limit some of those excesses directly or indirectly or subversively. But there is this significant obstacle, which is that there are very few women's voices in the Bible talking about how things ought to be. You see some examples of women outsmarting men, which is highly entertaining, and maybe even instructive in another way, but you don't see them moving towards creating some kind of new legislation. The daughters of Zelophehad are the big exception in that case. So the fact that they won their rights to an inheritance shows that there was a sense of justice. There was, I mean, this was a no-brainer, and yeah, they said, of course, they should do that. But it wasn't always sufficiently obvious to the Hebrew legalists, I think, because there weren't enough, or at least that we know of, there weren't enough female voices who could speak up on behalf of their sisters who were vulnerable. One way that we can improve on what we find here is to ensure that as we look for solutions, especially when we're addressing the plight of the lone woman today, that we listen, and we listen carefully to women's voices. And with that, woman's voice, Missy, I will now hand this over to you. You can take it from here.
Welcome back, for those of you that are back. Welcome here, for those of you that weren't here last week. I'm Missy Bird. I'm now famous because I'm on the cover of the newspaper, which makes me really excited. Yay for my fun signs. I am really excited to talk to you all about homeless women. I did research on homeless women in Los Angeles and Orange County when I was getting my PhD. And this is something that's dear to my heart because I am a formerly homeless teen, and because my partner and husband is also a formerly homeless teen. And I think this is one of those really remarkable opportunities where we can actually make a substantive and substantial difference for the homeless population, in particular homeless women. So the United Nations declared in 1991 that it is a human right to a standard of living that includes housing as a component of security. And housing for unaccompanied homeless adults in the United States continues to remain a challenge. So we place a priority on veterans, rightly so, and we place a priority on families, rightly so, but we do not place a priority on unaccompanied adults, whether they be male or female, although it is worse for homeless women. So according to a report, over 39% of all homeless people are women, and these are national numbers. So the number has actually gone up from 28% of adults to 39%. Among that population, a little over 4,000 are homeless women veterans, and a little over 23,000 are considered young women, so they are not over the age of 50. And so we have a big chunk of unaccompanied women that are homeless. Unaccompanied simply means they have no partner or they have no children. And although recent efforts have tried to address homelessness, they focus on residential stability and behavioral health outcomes, but they don't really focus on the goals of homeless individuals, and they don't focus on the goals of homeless women specifically. And so a lot of my focus in my research has been on figuring out what goals people have as they're transitioning into permanent supportive housing, and I'm going to talk about that in a little bit. But I really want to talk about homelessness here in Oregon as well, and I got some statistics on homelessness in Oregon, which you can see here. And these are statewide numbers based on what is called a point-in-time count. And if you've never experienced a point-in-time count, and homelessness is something that's interesting to you, it's a national count that is done each year where volunteers from the community literally go out in the middle of the night and count the homeless people who are sleeping. So it's done about 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning, and basically volunteers go through the community and literally count people while they're asleep or awake, because sometimes they're awake. And it's an opportunity to identify people, not only where they're staying, to identify maybe healthcare needs, and also other public health issues, but to also get a count. And so the point-in-time count occurs every year. And here in Oregon, they found that 57% of the total homeless population was unsheltered, and that a little over 9,000, almost 10,000 people were without children. I shouldn't say live in households, it should say literally living without children. And if those statistics hold true with the fact that approximately 1 in 4, 25% of the homeless population, although that number has risen since those 2015 statistics, if we're to underestimate, that means there's a little over 2,000 unaccompanied homeless women in Oregon today. What that looks like here in Benton County is that they identified in the point-in-time count in 2017 that 57 women in Benton County are unaccompanied, that 26 of them are sheltered and 31 of them are not.
What does that mean, sheltered or unsheltered?
That means they have access to somewhere to sleep at night. So shelter doesn't mean permanently sheltered, it doesn't mean housing. It literally means they have somewhere safe to go, well, relatively safe to go, so that they have a place to sleep overnight. It doesn't mean that they can stay in the shelter permanently. So we have 31 women here in Benton County that literally have nowhere to go. And I think this is important for a few reasons. And one of them is brought to light by a political science named Leila Fernandez, who's a feminist political scientist. And she says that movements for social or political transformation have faltered not because of the impossibility of realizing their visions of social justice, but because such transformations cannot be complete unless they are explicitly and inextricably linked to a deeper form of spiritual transformation on a mass basis. So what she's really saying there is that if we are to actually address the issue of homelessness, for example, and the lone woman, then one of the way that transformation will take place is by linking the social justice to spiritual transformation on a mass basis. And I think that's really what Sheldon sort of alluded to in his presentation, and what I'm hoping we can do when we're talking about homeless women, because like I said, it's a unique opportunity. If we're only talking about 57 women in the entire county, then that number says to me, I mean, there's probably 50 of us in this room. So that says to me that there's an opportunity for us to engage in some sort of action to really help and assist these women in a really thoughtful way with their input. Unaccompanied women are isolated in their community, and what that means is even within the homeless population, in order to stay safe, homeless women have to be separated. They keep themselves very invisible. It's very often why you don't see them, especially women who are older, why you don't see them in the streets very often. That's why you don't see them around big groups of people, like down on the river. Have you ever noticed when you're walking down by the river, there's big groups of people that are hanging out, but very often you won't find just a woman sitting off on her own, because it's dangerous to be in that position. There's also no public funding for programs specific to unaccompanied women. And what that means is the way we shift housing and HUD funding for homeless folks, and the way we shift how we address homelessness in America, the priority is given to families and veterans. And we're still grappling with how to deal with unaccompanied individuals with no family members. So if you're a single man or single woman, but most specifically if you're a single woman, it is nearly impossible to qualify for services because we have predicated the foundation of those services on priority going to homeless families and to veterans. And so the public funding stream, especially because if you are doing a women's only shelter, for example, you have to get through the language of how you are going to be providing services, which in some instances the Department of Housing has deemed as exclusionary to men, to LGBT, particularly transgender folks, have a problem finding shelter because they may be, their legal gender is not the same as the shelter they're trying to get into, and that creates problems with housing. And so that's a problem that we have really been having to work with as far as a community who works to abolish homelessness. There's little to no access to permanent housing because of priority given to veterans and families, and there's little research that distinguishes by gender. And so when we look for the research to back up the policy, which is what we often have to do, there's little research that separates gender or deals with gender, which is why a lot of researchers have been trying to focus on the gender differences among homeless men and homeless women so that they can address those issues a little more thoroughly. This is the demographics of the homeless women that I researched when I was doing my research, and that they are discovering these demographics tend to be universal across homeless populations, but there is more data that they're collecting across the country. So there were 117 homeless women that we asked the question of what their life goal is as they're transitioning into permanent supportive housing. So all of the people that we talked to, the 438 people that we interviewed, 117 of them were women, and they were all moving into permanent supportive housing, so they were transitioning off the street into housing. Quarter of women, homeless women, are homeless due to a violent crime that's committed against them. So 25% of the homeless female population has experienced some sort of domestic violence, and as a result, she has become homeless. The average lifetime of the homelessness of these women that we talked to was 4.3 years as opposed to 6 years for men. The women reported lower rates of achieving a high school education, so men had achieved a higher rate of a high school education, and about 75% of them reported they'd made it through high school, whereas women did not. Women reported that they were substance dependent at 42%. 76% of them had children, but they were either not in contact with those children or they had been separated from their children as a result of their homelessness. And then almost 80% of them had a comorbid physical and mental health disorder. And so they were, because their average age was 53 years old, and the average lifespan of a homeless man, for example, is 49 years. So the average age of death for a homeless man is 49. These women were already living older, much like women do, but their lifespan is still shortened by the result of their being homeless. And so many of them have these physical disorders, heart disease, diabetes, other instances because of aging, plus you have the comorbidity of the mental health issues. And so that just puts them at greater risk. I want to make a note about two things because we make a lot of assumptions about homeless people when we see them. Even I do it as someone who has been advocating for the homeless for a number of years. One of them is we see, especially among women, the rise in dogs. And I don't know if you've noticed that many homeless people have dogs, but especially women. And it's a form of protection. So they don't just have dogs because dogs are cute and cuddly and lovely as a companion. And I've heard a lot of people judge homeless people for having dogs because they have to feed them. And that costs money. And how could you have a dog? But for women in particular, it's a form of protection against violence. And then I've heard very recently a lot of criticism of homeless folks for having cell phones. But for women in particular, a cell phone is a lifeline. And it's not just a lifeline to protect her against violence, to be able to call 911 if she's experiencing some sort of violence on the street. But if she has children, as 76% of these women reported they do, it's also a way for them to be connected to their children, even if they're separated by the streets. And so I think we need to be really cautious and careful, and really use this education you now have as an opportunity when you hear your friends judging homeless people for their dogs or their cell phones or whatever that is. Remember that for women in particular and young people, this is a way of protecting themselves when they live on the street. We asked what the life goals were for homeless women, and they were more likely than men to report that education was a very large goal for them, nearly 25%, and that general health, getting their health back online, was a life goal as they were moving into permanent supportive housing. And for women who experience poverty, educational attainment is curtailed by economic circumstance. So despite the clear differences, structures are still in place that assist the homeless still rely on outdated foundations that are rooted in gender bias and the needs of homeless male veterans. So when we look at the structure of homelessness and how we help homeless folks in America, we've based it on this model of helping homeless male veterans. And then, so that's the foundation. And then we help families. And then we might help the homeless youth. And then we look at unaccompanied adults. And so, because of that, even though women distinctly have a different idea of what they want to attain once they get into housing, we're still going off of sort of this outmoded model that's based on gender differences for men. And I think that's a critical piece, a touch point for potential advocacy, if we can help religious leaders and advocates and elected officials in particular understand that maybe we need to be a little more innovative when we are talking about how we're going to address the needs of these 57 women in Benton County. And here's some opportunities maybe that I'll talk about more clearly towards the end of the presentation, but I think a real opportunity to make a big difference as a community, as all of us sitting here. A number of women really list becoming therapists, hairdressers, drug and alcohol counselors, medical assistants. Some of them wanted to become social workers and teachers. And they also really talked about needing educational programs, especially because many of them didn't finish high school. But when we send homeless women to like voc rehab or employment programs, they're based on a model, again, with the gender differences. And so they're based on putting women into jobs that are more considered blue-collar jobs that also include housekeeping and general cleaning and clerical work, and typically what we would consider more feminine-based jobs, whereas men who are homeless and transitioning into housing are offered higher-paying jobs in, say, construction and pipe fitting and other sort of manual labor jobs. And what's happening is that there's no consideration being given to the fact that men who are homeless have probably gotten through high school, whereas women have not. And there's little consideration to assess whether the educational structures that can help women be successful in their goals are in place. So, and it's also really important to remember that if we're going to help these women not just survive in permanent supportive housing, but thrive in permanent supportive housing, then offering them educational attainment that's actually true to what they want is the way to keep them successful in their housing and help them transition out of that and to stay permanently housed. So I have a few ideas for solutions. I have really big goals. I don't know if you've ever met me, but I have some big goals. One of them is for us to really look at how we request that elected officials, advocates, and religious leaders work to create permanent supportive housing for unaccompanied women. When I was doing my work in Salt Lake City, Utah, what we did to eliminate this. So in Salt Lake City in particular, they've completely housed the chronically homeless population in Salt Lake City. And they have a 0% chronically homeless rate in Salt Lake. And the way that they did that was they took these old Motel 6s that were on the bus line that had been abandoned for 20, 30 years. And they converted each motel room into a studio apartment. And then in the lobby of the motel, they put the police, they put case managers, and they put, so they had social workers, police, and food. So they had like people who could connect them to those services in the building. So there was always security, there was always safety, and they made it so that people could be housed, and they did a housing first model, which says that you don't have to be sober before you can get into living. You can get into living before you're sober. And the housing first model is what really, really works when we're talking about homelessness. So housing first instead of get sober, then get housing. Because you can't get sober. All the research has shown that you can't get sober without having a safe place to live. So we have that.
We have that in Corvallis
Yes.
for men.
Yes, for men. Exactly. Yes, that's exactly right. So we can do it here. We just have to figure out how. And for the 31 unsheltered women, it seems to me that there must be someplace somewhere in the entire county of Benton that we could find a shelter for. The other two things that I really want to highlight are that I think there's a really great opportunity with this, as strong as the public health school is at OSU, to really talk about gender-specific outreach to address health issues among unaccompanied women, especially because they tend to be older and they have different healthcare needs than men. And the other thing is I really would love to work with community colleges. We have such a strong community college with Lynn Benton here, to work with GED programs in community colleges and the Department of Ed to do non-traditional education among these women to at least get them to the space where they have a GED so that they can obtain employment. So I think that's another really great opportunity for advocacy to help these women and figure out how to build coalitions around those two things in particular. And then I really want you to know that we can do this. Like, this is a place where we can talk about this with our friends and our neighbors. We can tell our city, county, and state reps what we've learned about unaccompanied women. And I am happy to write scripts all day to help us be able to communicate with our elected officials to make this happen.
You mean where we all come in?
Yeah, we could have another potluck because I love all the food. Because they don't have to cook for them. No, I'm just kidding. Just kidding. But I really think we can do this. Like, I really, truly believe. And you know, when I was in Utah and I did research on homeless youth, and I was interested in how many of our homeless youth identified as LGBT. And this was back in 2003 when nobody was having this conversation. And I knew that our law said that we could shelter a youth, because I worked in child welfare, we could shelter a youth for no longer than 8 hours without parental consent or emancipation. 8 hours. In sub-zero temperatures, and that's it. You could never serve a kid again. And we didn't have a homeless youth shelter at the time. But I knew we didn't have an emancipation law. And so I took the 27 emancipation laws from 27 other states, and I sat down at my dining room table, and I wrote out line by line the lines that I thought would fit in Utah. And I taught myself how to lobby, and I passed that bill 2 years later. And it has helped hundreds of youth get emancipated so that they can get shelter. And if I can do that in Utah, y'all, we can totally do it here in Benton. I believe that we can help these women. I really do. And so I'm just super grateful for the time that you all are spending on your Wednesday nights to come here and listen to Sheldon, who every turn, he just educates me on all this amazing stuff and helps me see the platform for what we're really dealing with policy today. And so I hope we can go out and help these unaccompanied women. I think it would be really incredible. So thank you.